Domain expansions are the most powerful and hands down coolest ability in all of Jujutsu Kaisen. The ability to be able to warp someone into the manifestation of your desires, soul, and essence is one of the coolest things I've seen before in anime and is what lends credence to every single domain's variety. And not only does it look amazing, but in terms of combat, it's one of the most effective things you can do when fighting against another sorcerer. The user of the domain gets a substantial increase in their curse technique and is guaranteed to hit their target who is stuck within it. And with the wide variety of techniques in the series, each domain is vastly different from every other. So now that the series is wrapping up as we know it, I figured it would only be fitting to rank and explain each and every one of them. Some of the criteria that I used when looking at each of these domains was the strength of the domain, the usefulness of the effect, and how it benefited the user in battle. So without any further ado, let's jump into the list. Coming in at last place at 14, we have the Smallpox Deity's domain expansion. And I believe this is the only domain apart from Yuji's where we don't know what its name is. The Smallpox Deity is a cursed spirit that was a part of Kenjaku's cursed spirit collection while he was in Geto's body. And obviously, as the name implies, the Smallpox Deity is, would you believe it or not, centered around disease. Therefore, its domain expansion will transport anyone inside to a graveyard where he'll begin to trap people in a coffin for whoever's stuck inside it. He will then bury the coffin with a tombstone, and this is the form of the domain's guaranteed sure hit. If the user is trapped in this coffin underground for 3 seconds, they're afflicted with the smallpox disease, and that will be the end of them. So essentially you're being put inside of a coffin endlessly, and if you can't break out in 3 seconds, then you basically die. And don't get me wrong, this domain is incredibly formidable, but it's not a very serious threat for top level sorcerers who can break out of the coffin pretty easily. On top of that, it only targets those with the highest amount of cursed energy, so if multiple sorcerers enter this domain, they could easily counterattack this cursed spirit. Moving on next to 13, we have Dagon's domain expansion called Horizon of the Captivating Skanda. It's one of the biggest domain expansions in existence, as well as the most beautiful, being this giant sunny island, but it can also be one of the most dangerous if you ever get on Dagon's bad side. Given that Dagon is the embodiment of the fear of water-based natural disasters, that's basically what you're up against when you enter his domain. This domain's guaranteed sure hit takes the form of these giant fish-like shikigami that manifest out of nowhere and attack those in it. So basically the only way to counteract this is to have an anti-domain technique like Hollow Wicker Basket or Falling Blossom Emotion like we saw with Naobito, or have your own domain yourself. Although this is second to last, this is still a super powerful domain with it being able to hold off the likes of Nanami, Maki, and Naobito, 3 very strong sorcerers in their own right. Coming in at number 12, we have Megumi's domain expansion, Chimera Shadow Garden. And yes, I completely understand the possibility of its potential, but as of Megumi's current abilities, we just haven't seen that come to fruition yet. In essence, this domain allows its user to create copies of the 10 Shadow Shikigami through the medium of this thick shadow that is cast all over the ground. With this being the case, Megumi can summon multiple Nue, Toads, Max Elephants, or whatever suits his needs most during that time. The major flaw with this domain, of course, is the fact that Megumi can only hold this for a short amount of time, and it places a high amount of strain on his body. But I believe that its future utility and usefulness in battle gives it a slight edge over the bottom 2 on this list. But trust me, I would have loved to see multiple Maharagas summoned in a full-fledged domain. That would be so sick to see. Coming in at 11th place, we have Jogo's domain expansion, Coffin of the Iron Mountain. Similar to Dagon, Jogo is the embodiment of a natural disaster, with his being the fear of volcanoes. This domain transports whoever is trapped inside a large, active volcano where he's able to attack with large magma boulders as well as lava itself. Additionally, the heat of this domain is enough to completely melt whoever's inside, making it formidable to anyone without anti-domain measures. That being said though, it can easily be overpowered by a domain that's stronger and more refined, like we obviously see in his fight against Gojo. Next up at 10, we have Yorozu's domain, Threefold Affliction. And in all honesty, this domain is actually really powerful. We just saw it go against one of the strongest characters in the series, of course being Sukuna. But in order to understand this domain, we need to understand Yorozu's curse technique, being creation. This technique allows her to recreate any substance she recognizes and uses a ton of cursed energy because she is quite literally creating something from nothing. We've seen her create things like insect wings, liquid metal, insect armor, and even the mind-boggling True Sphere, which was stated to generate infinite pressure. Her domain expansion takes the form of a blank space except for some organic floating structures, and the sure hit of her domain applies to her constructed items, the pure sphere being one of them. And being hit with infinite pressure is one way to end a fight incredibly quickly, making this domain terrifying to go up against. However, domains more powerful than this, or it could be activated faster, would be able to counteract this, which leads us into number 9 being Mahito's domain expansion, self-embodiment of perfection. To understand this domain, we need to understand Mahito's ability, also known as idol transfiguration, which gives him the ability to transfigure the soul of his victims, turning them into these grotesque blob-like creatures. In order to do this though, he needs to be in physical contact with you, which is one of the disadvantages of this technique. Therefore, his domain takes the form of multiple hands where the person affected in the domain is standing right inside of a giant hand's palm. Quite literally, this domain puts you in the palm of Mahito's hands, where he can then cast his sure hit of idol transfiguration endlessly. So if you don't have a simple domain or a domain expansion of your own, you're basically screwed here. Paired with the fact that Mahito is a prodigy who could cast his domain expansion in 0.2 seconds like Gojo, makes this an absolutely terrifying domain expansion to go up against. Coming up next, we have Higuruma's domain expansion, Deadly Sentencing. You see, Higuruma's domain expansion and curse technique is all based on his experience as a lawyer. His domain expansion takes those within it into a courtroom where those trapped within it go through a trial as a defendant. In this domain, a Shikigami by the name of Judgeman will name a crime or misdeed of the defendant, and it's Higuruma's job to prove that they are guilty, which he's likely to do since he's a professional lawyer. If and when Higuruma proves that you are guilty, Judgeman has the ability to sentence the trapped individual based on their crime. Their punishment can range from confiscation of their curse technique to the death penalty, where Higuruma can then summon a sword which has the ability to kill you in a single attack. And given that this domain is non-lethal, there's no way to attack Higuruma as he's sentencing you. So in terms of utility and usefulness in battle, it is definitely one of the best in the entire series and sits right below the middle of our list. Coming up at number 7, we have none other than the GOAT Kinji Hikari's domain expansion, Idol Death Gamble. I won't go into too many of the specifics of this domain expansion, but if you fully want a breakdown on how it works, I suggest you check out my video explaining exactly what its mechanics are right here. But in essence, Hikari's domain takes the form of a pachinko parlor where the sure hit of his domain is that the person affected understands the rule of the domain immediately. And being non-lethal, the activation of this domain is much faster compared to those with lethal sure hits. The overall premise with this is that Hikari's goal is to hit 3 of the same number in a row, resulting in a jackpot. In short, there are a number of multipliers and chance boosters that help Hikari with this, but normally the chance of hitting a jackpot is 1 in 239. And once Hikari hits one, he's granted with a bonus where he's supplied with unlimited cursed energy for 4 minutes and 11 seconds, the length of the song Private Pure Love Train. What's even crazier is the fact that during this period of unlimited cursed energy, Hikari automatically outputs reverse curse technique, making him practically unkillable during that period of time. The reason I ranked him above Higuruma is because of the skill and advantage that Idol Death Gamble gives him. Although Higuruma's domain could in theory confiscate Hikari's curse technique, I think his experience as a sorcerer would ultimately allow him to overpower Higuruma before this happens. That is why I think Idol Death Gamble sits rightfully at number 7. Coming in at 6, we have Naoya Zenon's domain expansion, Time Cell Moon Palace, which is one of the coolest names for a domain in the series. So if you guys remember, Naoya inherited projection sorcery from another sorcerer in the Zenin clan, that being Naobito. And to get into Naoya's abilities is a little involved because projection sorcery is complicated, but the essence of it is that Naoya can move at 24 frames per second. And when he touches somebody, he transports them to that 24 FPS world. If the person he touches is not moving exactly at that speed, they become frozen in one of those frames for 1 whole second. This domain takes the form of a black empty area, except for a few floating particles, with a large eye behind the caster. The sure hit of this domain injects films of animation into the neck of its targets, and anyone who moves within this domain must abide by the 24 FPS rule of projection sorcery. This domain is so precise, in fact, that it can actually target individual cells, freezing them and disrupting them to cause countless small cuts and gashes to appear all over the body. So forcing any sort of movement could cause an arm or a leg to be cut off completely. So this domain is absolutely busted, and the only way to combat this is to make 24 precise movements in a single second or stand completely still, both of which are a terrible thing to abide by in a combat scenario. And while intimidating, I think somebody with enough control over their movements and body, or someone with their own domain expansion, would definitely have a chance at surviving this domain. Rounding out the top 5, we have the main character Yuji Itadori's domain expansion. And I know what you guys are thinking, but hear me out here. For what we know, Yuji only had access to this domain for about a month before the fight with Sukuna, but given more time to train and perfect it, this ability would definitely rival the top tiers in the verse. But essentially, Yuji's innate ability centers around being able to connect with other souls and the most inner parts of himself. His domain expansion is an outward expression of this ability where he's able to attack the soul of whoever is stuck within his domain, like we saw with Sukuna, who was in possession of Megumi's body. Paired with the new curse technique that he got from Sukuna's fingers being Dismantle, he has the ability to cut at the boundary of someone's soul, completely and utterly destroying them. And like I said, the only reason I placed him at the bottom of the top 5 was simply due to experience with the domain itself. Given there are people still on this list with much more experience in their domains, as well as those with open barriers, I believe Yuji would get outclassed by these higher level fighters. But on the same coin, knowing how fast Yuji learns and grows, I wouldn't suspect him to stay here for long if we ever learn what his full potential looks like. Now moving on to 4, we have Kenjaku's domain being named Womb Profusion. Kenjaku's domain takes the form of a giant pillar made up by cursed spirits. Similar to another domain on this list, it's an open barrier, meaning that it's among the strongest types of domains in the entire series. We aren't really sure what the sure hit of the domain is, but to me it seems like it revolves around Kenjaku's gravity curse technique that he got from Yuji's mom, Kaori. And this domain was so powerful that while only being open for a split second, he was able to severely injure a special great sorcerer being Yuki and shred through her simple domain instantaneously. And being a sorcerer whose barriers were regarded as one of the strongest in the series, it goes without saying that his domains would be incredibly potent as well. The reason I can't put him any higher is because the 3 people above on this list would have a direct counter through their own domain, which would damage him to the point where he wouldn't be able to sustain a domain clash. Therefore, the most evil sorcerer Kenjaku sits right here at 4th place. Now at 3rd place, we have the domain expansion of the Jujutsu prodigy Yuta Okkotsu, called Authentic Mutual Love. This domain is my favorite looking in the entire series, with swords littered all across the battlefield and these cross-like structures sticking up from the ground. Yuta's innate curse technique is called Copy, and as the name implies, allows him to copy the curse technique of anyone that Rika consumes. His domain takes this to another level, given that each sword across the battlefield is the embodiment of one of the many abilities that he's copied. Therefore, Yuta can take any of those katanas and activate a copied curse technique without restriction, and this serves as the sure hit effect of his domain. Like in the fight with Sukuna, we saw him use Druve Shikigami technique, Uro's Thin Icebreaker, and Angel's curse technique, Jacob's Ladder. Paired with his astronomical amounts of cursed energy, I could definitely see this domain overpowering the likes of every domain on this list that has come before it. Not to mention that the versatility and flexibility that Copy gives Yuta is an insane advantage to have in any battle. Now moving on to 2nd place, we have none other than the King of Curses, Ryumen Sukuna's domain expansion being Malevolent Shrine. And this domain is completely busted, as you could have guessed, with all of its cleave and dismantle attacks being the sure hit. It's basically a guarantee to kill its opponents, given Sukuna's cursed energy refinement is one of the best that we have seen throughout the entire series. Additionally, like Kenjaku's domain, this technique has an open barrier, meaning that it outclasses every closed barrier domain on this list apart from one. We know that casting a domain without a barrier is essentially a groundbreaking feat in the world of Jujutsu, given that it's been compared to painting without a canvas or holding a glass of water without a cup. Additionally, Sukuna imposed a restriction on his domain where he allows his opponents the opportunity to escape, but in exchange, the range of the technique expands to 200 meters. So yeah, as I mentioned, this technique is practically an instant win condition unless you are a person wielding the domain at the top of this list, and I'm sure you guys all know who this would be. Coming in at number 1, we have Gojo's domain expansion, Unlimited Void. This domain plays off of Gojo's technique, Limitless, where he's able to literally bring the concepts of infinity into reality. Through the Limitless, Gojo is able to prevent anything from hitting him, repel anything away with extreme force using the power of red, or pull things towards him with the power of blue. The domain takes this technique to another level, with the sure hit coming in the form of endless information flooding a person's mind all at once. The influx of this information is so great that the person affected simply can't process it all at once and basically goes into a trance-like state immediately. This gives Gojo agency to basically do what he wants and to take out whoever he's fighting against. And the reason that he's placed at the top of all domains in JJK is because we have seen him do some crazy things with it that other sorcerers simply aren't able to do. Similar to Mahito, he could shorten the duration of his domain to 0.2 seconds, which was enough to stun a special grade curse like Mahito himself. And as we saw in his fight with Sukuna, we see he has the ability to change the conditions of his barrier to decrease the size to that of a basketball, hardening it and mitigating any disadvantages it would have against open domains. And we know from an attack potency standpoint that the output of this domain is much higher than Sukuna's, given that once he was hit by it for a split second, he was immobilized immediately. And that's why Unlimited Void takes the spot as the best domain in Jujutsu Kaisen. If you guys like this video, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe so I can continue to make the best anime content that you guys all want to see. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I look forward to chatting with you in the next one. Stay curious, anime fam. Peace.